Every great story needs a bold opening, and ours begins in the rugged hills and palaces of Macedonia. Forget polished marble Athens or philosophical debates in crowded agoras. Here we start with something more raw, a land of ambitious kings, fierce warriors, and neighbors who raised their eyebrows whenever someone said Macedonia. Into this world comes a boy named Alexander, not yet a conqueror, not yet a legend, but already carrying the weight of destiny like an oversized cloak. We promise to follow him from cradle to battlefield, from the palace nursery to the deserts of Asia, all the way until he makes the world bend to his will. But don't be fooled. This is not just about spears clashing and crowns glittering. This is a story about an audacious dreamer who wanted to outshine heroes of myth and make history his playground. So buckle up, because from this very first step in Pella, we are chasing the path of a prince who would become Alexander the Great. And trust me, the ride is going to be wilder than a chariot without brakes. Before we dive headfirst into Alexander's destiny, let's zoom out and check the backdrop. Macedonia. Think of it as the tough kid on the Greek playground. Muscular, loud, and often underestimated by the cool kids down south in Athens and Sparta. While the southern Greeks were busy polishing their statues and debating philosophy, Macedonians were busy swinging swords, breeding horses, and occasionally reminding everyone they were, in fact, Greek too. The land itself was a patchwork of rugged mountains, fertile valleys, and villages that smelled more like sweat and iron than olive oil and poetry. To the Athenians, Macedonia felt like the countryside cousin, strong but a little rough around the edges. Yet behind this roughness was a hidden advantage: unity under a strong king and an army drilled to perfection. This was the soil that produced Alexander, a place where ambition wasn't an option but a survival skill. So while the rest of Greece looked down on Macedonia, Macedonia was quietly sharpening its sword, waiting for the perfect moment to prove the world wrong, and that moment would come sooner than anyone expected. Now that we know Macedonia wasn't exactly everyone's favorite dinner guest in Greece, it's time to meet the man who flipped the script, King Philip II. Picture a guy with the charisma of a rock star, the ambition of a startup founder, and the ruthlessness of, well, someone who really doesn't like losing. Philip took a kingdom that outsiders mocked as backward and turned it into a military powerhouse, complete with a shiny new invention: the Macedonian phalanx. Those terrifying lines of soldiers bristling with extra-long spears. While Athens debated democracy and Sparta polished its abs, Philip was busy conquering neighbors and collecting allies like trading cards. Of course, his idea of alliance usually came with a sword at your throat and a friendly reminder: join us or else. His dream was simple yet outrageous: to unite all of Greece under his rule and then march east against the mighty Persian Empire. And as crazy as it sounded, he was pulling it off. Little did he know, in the royal nursery, a sharp-eyed boy was watching closely, learning that ambition wasn't just a family trait, it was practically the family business. If Philip was the iron fist of Macedonia, then Olympias was the mysterious flame that shaped Alexander's inner fire. She wasn't your typical queen smiling politely at banquets. Oh no, Olympias was rumored to keep snakes as pets and whisper prayers to exotic gods. Imagine being a kid and finding your mom casually chatting with a serpent in the palace. Therapy bills for that would last a lifetime. But for young Alexander, this was normal. Olympias was fiercely protective, fiercely ambitious, and, let's face it, fiercely terrifying to anyone who crossed her. She told her son from day one that he wasn't just another royal brat. He was destined for greatness, maybe even divine. In her eyes, Alexander wasn't simply Philip's heir. He was chosen by the gods, the star pupil of fate itself. With a father building armies and a mother feeding him tales of divine destiny, Alexander grew up in a household where ambition wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. And while Philip drilled him in military tactics, Olympias whispered that he might be more than human. With that kind of parenting combo, is it any wonder the boy aimed for world domination? And then, as if Philip's military genius and Olympias's divine drama weren't enough, the universe decided to add special effects to Alexander's birth. According to legend, on the very night he was born in Pella, The temple of Artemis in Ephesus mysteriously caught fire, which priests immediately spun as a cosmic sign that something big had just entered the world. Neighbors probably just thought, bad luck, but Olympias took it as confirmation that her child was no ordinary baby. Some claimed a thunderbolt split the sky. Others whispered that serpents were seen curling around the palace walls. Basically, it was less like a regular birth announcement and more like a trailer for the next blockbuster hero. For Alexander himself, these stories would become the soundtrack of his destiny. He wasn't just Philip's son, he was stamped with divine approval before he even learned how to walk. Growing up hearing that the cosmos might have set the stage for you tends to do funny things to your ego. Let's just say Alexander wasn't about to dream small. With omens blazing in the background, the stage was set for a childhood where ordinary was never an option. Growing up with omens swirling around his birth and two larger-than-life parents, Alexander was never going to be a quiet child. From an early age, he was fiery, curious, and just a little too fearless for his own good. If someone told him, "Don't touch that," he was already halfway through touching it. If another boy challenged him to a game, Alexander turned it into a full-blown competition, complete with rules, strategies, and the occasional bruised nose. He wasn't the kind of child who sat politely in the corner. He was the one climbing walls, questioning teachers, and demanding to know why the sky was blue and why his father wasn't already king of the world. His temper was quick, his curiosity endless, and his courage sometimes bordered on reckless. But these traits, frustrating for his tutors, were precisely the sparks that hinted at a future commander. In a palace where discipline was expected, Alexander stood out as the boy who tested boundaries just to see how far they would bend. One thing was clear: ordinary childhood antics weren't in his DNA. He was practicing in miniature for the battles of adulthood. Of course, even a future conqueror needs playmates, and Alexander had his fair share of childhood companions. But here's the twist. Their games weren't about hopscotch or hide-and-seek. They were mini-military campaigns. While most kids built sandcastles, Alexander and his friends staged sieges, complete with wooden swords, shouted war cries, and the occasional bruised shin. Hephaestion, who would later become his lifelong confidant, was often right there beside him, the general to Alexander's king. These games weren't just child's play. They were rehearsals for the empire building that lay ahead. When Alexander lost, which was rare, he'd sulk like any other boy, but then immediately redesign the battle plan so next time, victory was guaranteed. For his friends, it was both fun and exhausting, because when Alexander played, you didn't just play, you trained. To outsiders, it looked like kids fooling around. To history, it looked suspiciously like the opening chapters of global conquest. Even in the courtyard of Pella, laughter and ambition were already marching side by side. Alexander's childhood wasn't only about snake-whispering moms and make-believe battles with friends. The Palace of Pella was also full of hardened warriors who treated training like breakfast. And young Alexander? He treated the barracks like his second classroom. While most royal kids might peek into kitchens to steal sweets, Alexander snuck into the training grounds to watch the soldiers sharpen blades and drill in formation. He peppered veterans with endless questions. Why hold the spear this way? Why march in step? Why not just charge screaming like a madman? The soldiers, amused by the boy's persistence, sometimes indulged him, letting him carry a shield far too heavy for his size, or teaching him tricks of swordplay. He learned discipline, courage, and the idea that an army wasn't just men with weapons, but a living machine that needed precision. For Alexander, the smell of sweat, iron, and leather became just as familiar as incense in the palace halls. By the time he could ride a horse without falling, he already understood that soldiers weren't just faceless tools. They were the heartbeat of an empire, and soon enough, he'd prove to be their fiercest heartbeat of all. All that sneaking into barracks and turning playgrounds into battlefields soon paid off, because even as a boy, Alexander had the uncanny ability to boss people around without them minding too much. He wasn't just playing at being king, he acted like one. If a group of kids argued over who should lead their army, Alexander was already giving orders, assigning roles, and planning the attack formation before anyone could vote. And strangely enough, his friends often followed. partly because his confidence was magnetic, and partly because resisting him usually meant losing badly. Even grown soldiers noticed the boy had presence, that invisible spark that made people straighten their backs and listen. He combined Philip's authority with Olympias's intensity, sprinkled with his own fiery curiosity. Whether he was leading mock charges or debating philosophers to be, Alexander carried himself as though greatness was already a done deal. The palace courtyards of Pella weren't just echoing with laughter, they were echoing with the early rumblings of command. History likes to say leaders are made, not born, but in Alexander's case, it felt like the universe skipped the waiting list and gave him the crown early, at least in spirit. Looking back, it feels almost unfair how destiny stacked the deck for young Alexander. A father who was busy reshaping Greece, a mother who swore her son had divine blood, omens that lit up the night sky, and a childhood spent drilling with soldiers and outsmarting friends in war games. Was there really any chance he'd grow up to be an ordinary farmer? Not likely. By the time he was barely a teenager, whispers around Pella already painted him as different, touched by fate. Some said he had the temper of a lion. Others swore his eyes burned with the hunger of a man twice his age. But everyone agreed. This boy wasn't just playing at being a leader. He was preparing for something bigger, though none could guess just how big. His journey was only beginning, yet even now the outlines of greatness were hard to miss. The world didn't know it yet, but history had already chosen its next headline act. Alexander wasn't simply growing up. He was stepping onto a stage the gods themselves seemed to have set, and from here, the story of a legend was ready to unfold. As Alexander grew older, Philip realized that his son's fiery temper and endless curiosity needed more than sword drills and palace games. So like a modern parent hiring the best tutor money could buy, Philip called in the intellectual superstar of the age, Aristotle. Yes, that. Aristotle, student of Plato, master of logic, and the kind of teacher who could turn a royal brat into a philosopher king. Imagine the scene, a prince who preferred charging around with wooden swords suddenly being told to sit down, listen, and discuss the meaning of virtue. At first, it probably felt like torture. But Aristotle wasn't just any tutor. He mixed big ideas with practical lessons, explaining how philosophy could be as sharp as a spear and as useful as a shield. Philip hoped his son would learn not just how to conquer lands, but also how to rule minds. It was a gamble, really, pairing one of history's greatest philosophers with one of history's most impatient kids. But it worked. Under Aristotle's watch, Alexander's restless energy began to take shape, transforming him from a wild prince into a thinker with ambitions larger than empires. Once Aristotle settled into the role of royal tutor, he didn't waste time handing out boring homework. Instead, he opened up the universe for Alexander. Quite literally. Philosophy wasn't just abstract puzzles, it was a toolkit for thinking about power, justice, and even the stars above. One day the boy might be sketching geometry in the dirt. The next he'd be peering at plants, poking at animals, or debating whether virtue was learned or innate. Aristotle wasn't content with teaching a prince how to win arguments. He wanted to build a mind sharp enough to rule the world. And Alexander, despite his restless spirit, soaked it up like a sponge. Sure, he sometimes rolled his eyes at lengthy lectures, but he also began to see how science, art, and philosophy could strengthen an empire as much as soldiers and spears. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander discovered that knowledge was a different kind of weapon, one that could outlast any battle. With every lesson, the wild prince was being shaped into something new, a leader whose curiosity was as dangerous as his sword arm. After Aristotle opened the universe to his pupil, he opened a scroll, and out marched Homer. From that day, Alexander wasn't just a prince. He became the world's earliest Achilles fanboy. Legend says he kept a special annotated copy of the Iliad by his bedside, thanks to Aristotle. And yes, he practically slept with it under his pillow like a royal security blanket. He devoured the verses not for bedtime lullabies, but for lessons. Glory must be earned, rage must be steered, and friendship can be a kingdom's compass. He pictured Troy not as distant myth, but as a training ground, how to pick a battlefield, how to rally men, how not to let pride get you stabbed before lunchtime. Hephaestion, ever at his side, played the calm counterweight, a Patroclus to the prince's aspiring Achilles. The more Alexander read, the more he walked like a hero in progress. Chin higher, questions sharper, ambitions upgraded. Homer didn't make him softer. Homer gave his fire a map. And while other youths bragged about wrestling or horses, Alexander was memorizing the playbook of legends, planning to write his own footnotes in history, preferably with fewer tragic endings and better logistics. Fresh off his Homer high, Alexander discovered that heroics are great, but strategy keeps heroes alive. Under Aristotle's calm grilling and Philip's noisy war councils, the prince learned to turn fire into focus. He drew battle lines in the dirt with a stick, pushed pebbles around like miniature phalanxes, and asked the kind of questions that make generals sweat. What happens if the enemy refuses to fight on our favorite hill? What if the river floods? What if our supply mules decide to be dramatic? He learned that terrain is a weapon, timing is a blade, and morale can flip a battle faster than a trumpet. Leadership, he realized, wasn't just shouting orders. It was reading people, who's brave, who's brittle, and placing them where they'd become their best. When to advance like Achilles, when to faint like a fox, and when to retreat, rebranding it, of course, as luring them into a better mistake. Hephaestion played opponent and ally in endless war games, while Aristotle kept asking, why this, not that, until the plans could stand on their own legs. Little by little, the boy who loved glory started loving maps too. Next up, he'd need a partner who could carry him into those plans at full speed, a horse worthy of all this plotting. Between Aristotle's lectures and Philip's war councils, Alexander accidentally subscribed to the full classical Greek culture deluxe package. Mornings at the gymnasium taught him that excellence wasn't just about biceps, it was arete, mind and muscle in a well-oiled alliance, sometimes literally thanks to olive oil. At the theater, he learned that tragedy warns kings not to let ego outrun logistics, while comedy exists to roast those kings when they forget. He practiced rhetoric until even the courtyard pigeons looked persuaded. He copied sculptors' poses, discovering that a heroic stance starts with the feet, and he plucked a lyre just enough to look cultured without threatening professional musicians. From poets, he absorbed measure and metaphor. From philosophers, moderation and method. From the polis ideal, duty to something larger than himself. Macedonia's rough edge didn't vanish. It got polished by Attic shine, discipline married to curiosity, courage tempered by proportion. Hephaestion rolled his eyes through the more dramatic choruses, but even he admitted that Greek language and stories felt like a blueprint for binding peoples together. By the time the sun set, Alexander wasn't only dreaming of victories, he was rehearsing how a conqueror might teach, build, and blend cultures. Next lesson, you can't found cities without first mastering the horse that carries you there. Books sharpened his mind, but the training yard toughened everything else. Alexander learned the art of staying on a horse that very much preferred he wasn't there. Remember, no stirrups in those days, just thighs of steel and sheer stubbornness. Mornings began with dust, snorts, and a riding master who spoke fluent sarcasm. Circle drills, tight turns, sprint and stop, then straight into cavalry games, tossing the javelin at straw targets, slicing reeds with a short sword at the gallop, and leaning dangerously to snatch a ring from a post without kissing the ground. He discovered that balance beats bravado, that reins are a conversation, not a tug of war, and that a calm breath steadies both rider and mount. After riding came weapons, spear thrust from the saddle, xiphos cuts, shield work on foot, and wrestling that allegedly built character and definitely built bruises. Hephaestion kept pace, trading friendly jabs and the occasional victorious smirk. Aristotle watched once, muttered something about applied physics, and retreated to safer scrolls. By sunset, the prince could vault onto a moving horse and make it look intentional. Yet every stable whispers about a horse no one can master, a dark, storm-eyed creature with opinions. Alexander hears the rumor and smiles. Challenge accepted. Remember that storm-eyed horse from the stable whispers? He now arrives with hooves, opinions, and zero interest in riders. Grooms fly like confetti. Philip sighs, the universal dad sigh that means, we're selling this one for parts. Alexander watches, not his muscles, his brain. Something's off. The beast keeps spinning away, snorting at the ground? No, at the dark shape racing beside him, fear of his own shadow. The prince drops his cloak, approaches slowly, voice low, hands open. He turns the stallion straight into the sun so the shadow slips behind. The trembling quiets. One breath, two strokes along the neck, a gentle play on the reins, then a sudden liquid vault to the back. No wrestling, no yelling, just balance, timing, and the promise of speed. They surge forward, dust blooms. The crowd forgets to breathe. Alexander leans, guides, lets the horse be thunder, and himself the lightning's aim. When they return, Philip's grin says more than any medal, though he does toss in a legendary compliment about finding a kingdom big enough for that ambition. Lesson logged, sometimes leadership is simply turning the problem toward the light. Also, note to self, partnership acquired, name, Bucephalus. Warranty, void if ego exceeds horsepower. After the thunderclap with Bucephalus, Alexander didn't ride alone. He rode with his human constant, Hephaestion. If the prince was momentum, Hephaestion was calibration. If Alexander pointed at the horizon, Hephaestion quietly counted the rations to get there. They trained shoulder to shoulder, bled on the same dust, and split tasks like professionals. Alexander handled speeches and impossible ideas. Hephaestion handled silence, logistics, and the occasional reality check. Their friendship wasn't loud, it was fluent. A look across a courtyard that said, advance, and another that replied, already planned. Thanks to Homer, they joked about Achilles and Patroclus, but the joke kept landing because it was almost true. Courage paired with loyalty, fire with steady flame. Aristotle noticed their debates lasted longer when they argued together against him. Philip noticed his son's temper cooled faster when Hephaestion was nearby. Even Bucephalus learned the rhythm, one hand on the bridle, two minds on the route. In a world of alliances brokered with wine and daggers, this was the rare pact sealed with trust and time. The boy king in progress had found his echo, his counterweight, his safest counsel, and he would need it soon. Fathers cast long shadows, and Philip's was about to stretch across every plan the two boys dared to make. Fathers make long shadows. Conqueror fathers make solar eclipses. Philip was the kind of dad who could win a war before lunch and still have time to critique your javelin stance at dinner. Alexander admired him? Who didn't? But admiration comes with splinters when you're the heir. One moment, Philip clapped his son on the shoulder. Good thinking. The next, he barked across the courtyard for more discipline, less drama. The boy learned fast. Praises alone, interest due in results. Their talk swung between strategy and subtext. Philip loved loyalty and logistics. Alexander, glory and speed. When the king boomed in council, the prince's jaw tightened. Not rebellion exactly, more like, give me a turn. The Bucephalus triumph didn't help. It raised expectations and eyebrows in equal measure. Enter Hephaestion, the human fire extinguisher, and Aristotle, the translator of pride into patience. Alexander practiced a new art, walking beside power without tripping over it. He studied his father's methods like a living textbook, alliances, timing, the famous phalanx, and tucked away the differences he'd someday test. Love, certainly. Friction, also certainly. In the kingdom of sharp minds and sharper spears, this was chapter 1 of an old story. The sun measuring the shadow, the father measuring the son. The curtain on boyhood doesn't fall with a drum roll. It clicks into place when the practiced sword suddenly weighs like the real thing. Alexander feels it now, scrolls in one hand, reins in the other, and the horizon looking suspiciously like a to-do list. Aristotle's questions still buzz in his ears. Why this, not that? Philip's footsteps echo behind. Results, not speeches. And Hephaestion's steady nod translates both into action. Even Bucephalus, storm-eyed and opinionated, stands unusually calm, as if the horse, too, recognizes promotions. Childhood was for rehearsals, pebble armies, dusty courtyards, mock debates. Next up, audiences that don't clap politely and maps that bite back. The prince checks the pieces of his new toolkit. A mind tuned by philosophy, a spine toughened by the training yard, a friend who counts rations before glory, and a father's shadow to measure himself against. He straightens the cloak, loosens the jaw, and chooses a smile that says, ready but not reckless. If Achilles taught him how legends move, experience has taught him how leaders stop, think, and then move anyway. Dawn edges the roofs of Pella like a gold seal on a fresh decree. Time to trade theory for orders. Time to graduate from potential energy to momentum. Before Athens could finish polishing a statue, Philip had added another city-state to his to-do list. He expanded Macedonian power with a three-piece toolkit: steel, silver, and speeches. Steel meant the redesigned phalanx, extra-long sarissas turning infantry into a walking porcupine that nobody wanted to hug. Silver bought friends, or at least quiet neighbors. And speeches? Philip could toast you into a treaty before the amphora ran dry. He married cleverly, flattered shamelessly, and when charm failed, arrived with siege engines that looked like mobile carpentry shops from Hades. The cavalry hammered, the phalanx anviled, and Greek politics, once a shouting match, started sounding like an orchestra with Philip waving the baton. City after city discovered that autonomy had a surprisingly flexible definition. Out of this came the Corinthian League, a club you technically joined voluntarily, with membership benefits including do what Philip says about Persia. Mapmakers ran out of space to write independent. Behind the king, a sharp-eyed teenager took notes, learning that conquest wasn't just charging bravely, it was budgeting, bribing, and building bridges you might later march across. Greece was almost tuned. The overture was ending. Next movement, hand the baton to the apprentice and see if he can keep tempo while the drums of war get louder. 16. For most teenagers, that means awkward poetry and sneaking wine. For Alexander, it meant, congratulations, you're acting regent. Don't burn the kingdom down. When Philip marched off on campaign, he left the boy in charge of Macedonia. The ink on his homework wasn't even dry before trouble arrived. A Thracian tribe thought it was the perfect time to raid. Instead of panicking or asking Aristotle for an emergency lecture on diplomacy, Alexander saddled up. He gathered a small force, rallied them with fiery words, and rode straight into the mess. The prince who once played with pebble armies was now maneuvering flesh-and-blood soldiers, and it worked. He crushed the raiders, founded a new city on the spot, because apparently 16-year-olds need hobbies, and named it Alexandropolis. Subtle. Returning victorious, he wasn't just Philip's son anymore. He was Macedonia's young commander, proving that leadership didn't wait for birthdays or coronations. The soldiers saw discipline wrapped in daring, the nobles saw a youth who could wear the purple seriously, and the rest of Greece heard a rumor. The shadow of Philip might already have a shadow of its own. If Alexander's regency was a warm-up, Cheronea was the main event. The year 338 BCE, Philip faced the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, an alliance that thought democracy and hoplites could out-stubborn Macedonian innovation. The battle lines stretched across the plain, sarissas glittering like a steel forest. Philip commanded the center, but the left wing? That honor went to his teenage son. Imagine being barely out of adolescence and handed thousands of soldiers with the unspoken note, "Don't lose." Alexander didn't flinch. He drove the companion cavalry straight into the sacred band of Thebes, the elite hoplite unit famed for bravery and not losing. Dust, bronze, and chaos swirled. Yet in that melee, Alexander's charge broke the line, scattering legends like bowling pins. It wasn't just muscle, it was instinct. The timing, the angle, the boldness. The Macedonian victory was decisive. Greece effectively unified under Philip. But stories spread faster than treaties. The prince had ridden like a storm and crushed the uncrushable. Philip had conquered Greece. Yes, but everyone was whispering about the boy at Cheronea who looked suspiciously like the future. Cheronea wasn't just a victory, it was a coming-out party for Alexander's military instincts. While most young nobles were still figuring out how to wear a cloak without tripping, he was already reading battlefields like a chessboard. Veterans noticed he didn't just fight bravely, he fought smart. He anticipated when enemy lines would falter, spotted weak points faster than messengers could run, and had the nerve to act before the moment passed. His charge against the sacred band wasn't luck. It was calculation wrapped in audacity. Afterwards, soldiers swapped stories of how the prince rode into chaos with the calm of someone ordering lunch. Philip himself, not easily impressed, admitted his son had the look, that unsettling calm that generals get before turning maps into headlines. Yet Alexander's genius wasn't only in tactics, it was in presence. Men followed him not just because he was the king's son, but because he radiated conviction, like someone who believed destiny took reservations and he had booked the best table. Greece was now under Macedonian dominance, but the rumor buzzing louder than Philip's treaties was simple. This boy wasn't waiting to inherit power, he was already test driving it. Victory banners still hung from Chaeronea when palace gossip introduced a new storyline. Philip was remarrying. The bride? Cleopatra Eurydice, young, beautiful, and, awkward pause, Macedonian. That last detail mattered because Olympias, Alexander's mother, hailed from Epirus, and the new queen's Macedonian blood threatened to reshuffle the family deck. At the wedding feast, wine flowed, tongues loosened, and one courtier decided it was the perfect moment to toast a pure Macedonian heir. The implication landed like a spear across the table. Olympias bristled. Alexander slammed his cup down, quipping whether his father expected him to be demoted to step-prince. Philip, already deep in the amphora, lurched to his feet, sword half drawn, only to trip over his own regal dignity and sprawl. Guests froze, then whispered furiously, and the feast dissolved in awkward silence. The teenage prince stormed out with his mother, the rift now public. It wasn't just family drama, it was politics. Succession had suddenly become a spectator sport. In that fiery glare across the table, Greece saw not just a father and son quarreling, but two storms gathering strength, destined to collide before destiny pushed one of them off stage. The wedding fiasco didn't end at the spilled wine. Olympias, equal parts queen and thunderstorm, packed her things with the efficiency of someone who'd done this in her head 1,000 times. Alexander, still fuming from the insult of being called a half-prince, marched beside her. Together, mother and son staged the most dramatic exit since Dionysus invented theater. The palace corridors whispered as servants peeked from behind columns. The lioness and her cub were leaving. Olympias returned to her homeland of Epirus, where snakes in the temple probably seemed more polite than Macedonian courtiers. Alexander drifted south for a while, gathering friends, allies, and perhaps a little more pride than luggage. For Philip, the sight of his heir walking out with his queen consort was less family tiff and more succession crisis with extra steps. Around the symposium couches, nobles whispered, would Alexander still be the future? Or was Cleopatra Eurydice's potential child now the golden ticket? Yet even in exile light, Alexander sharpened himself. He wasn't sulking in shadows, he was rehearsing comebacks. Because if destiny was a play, he refused to be written out before the second act. Family drama in Macedonia was never a quiet affair. It was more like a stage play where the actors refused to stick to the script. After the explosive wedding fallout and dramatic exits, whispers of reconciliation began to circulate. Philip, calculating as ever, realized that an angry heir and an estranged queen made for lousy propaganda when you were planning to invade Persia. So envoys were dispatched, olive branches extended, and suddenly invitations appeared for banquets where everyone was expected to smile like nothing had happened. Alexander returned to court, still bristling, but aware that storming off forever wasn't great for a career path that required an actual throne. Olympias too re-entered the palace orbit, her glare sharp enough to slice amphorae in half. The reunion was awkward. Polite greetings, forced toasts, and the kind of silence where every cough sounded like a political statement. Yet for all the tension, it worked, at least temporarily. Father, mother, and son stood under the same roof again, playing their roles for the sake of appearances. In truth, it wasn't healing, just duct tape on a cracked vase. But duct tape can hold long enough when destiny insists on keeping the family cast together for Act Two. For Philip, conquering Greece was just the appetizer. Persia was the banquet. Fresh from Chæronea, he turned his gaze eastward, where Darius III ruled a sprawling empire rich in gold and pride. To the Macedonian king, it looked like an irresistible challenge, and a chance to write his name alongside the greats. Plans crackled through the palace, armies to be raised, ships to be built, alliances to be polished until they gleamed. Messengers darted like ants, generals sharpened sarissas, and Greek city-states found themselves recruited into a new league that sounded suspiciously like Philip's personal fan club. For Alexander, the preparations were half thrilling, half frustrating. He had proven himself on the battlefield, yet he remained the prince in waiting, watching his father lay claim to the dream of Asia. Still, he absorbed every detail, the logistics, the speeches, the maps covered in pins. If destiny was knocking, Alexander was listening through the door. The stage was nearly set, the actors rehearsed, the props assembled, and the curtain about to rise on the grandest war of the age. But backstage, fate was already sharpening a dagger, preparing a plot twist no one saw coming. The grand campaign against Persia never even left the harbor. Just as Philip was polishing his speeches and sharpening his sarissas, fate staged a coup with a dagger. At Aegae, during the wedding celebrations of his daughter, Philip entered the theater in all his royal confidence. Crowds cheered, musicians played, and the king strode proudly, cloaked in purple, bronze glinting in the sun. Then from the shadows, one of his own bodyguards lunged forward. A blade flashed. The cheers twisted into screams, and Philip II collapsed before he could even finish his entrance. The assassin was cut down on the spot, but the damage was irreversible. The king who united Greece lay dead at the threshold of his greatest dream. Panic rippled through the court. Was this revenge, conspiracy, or cosmic irony? No one knew for certain. What they did know, the throne had just turned into the hottest seat in the Mediterranean. And while courtiers scrambled, Olympias whispered and nobles schemed, Alexander, not yet 20, stood on the edge of destiny. The spotlight suddenly his, whether he was ready or not. The dagger at Aegae had barely cooled before Macedonia faced the question, who now wears the crown? Whispers swirled, daggers hid behind smiles, and every noble in the room suddenly discovered a distant claim to the throne. But Olympias moved faster than gossip, rallying support for her son with the ferocity of a lioness guarding her cub. Alexander, not yet 20, stood tall amid the chaos. No longer just the boy who charged at Chæronea, he was now the man demanded by destiny. The army, still buzzing with memories of his courage, proclaimed him king. Courtiers bent their knees, some out of loyalty, others out of sheer survival instinct. Even in the middle of grief, Alexander understood the theater of power, appearing calm, issuing sharp orders, making it clear he was Philip's heir, not just by blood, but by will. The torch of empire passed in a swirl of mourning and ambition. Macedonia had lost its king, but gained a ruler whose eyes already looked beyond Greece. At 20, Alexander wore the crown like a soldier wears armor, less as decoration, more as a promise of battles yet to come. The moment Philip hit the ground in Aegae, the Greek world collectively whispered, "Showtime." Macedonia's neighbors, ever the opportunists, assumed the young heir would be too green to keep the empire intact. Athens grumbled about freedom, Thebes flexed its muscles, and even some Macedonian nobles weighed the odds of playing musical thrones. In other words, everyone smelled opportunity like wolves circling a wounded lion. But Alexander was no bleeding cub. Barely 20, he walked into the storm with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed for this his whole life. His first move wasn't panic, it was presence. He appeared in public, armored and regal, demanding loyalty with a stare sharp enough to pierce bronze. He promised soldiers glory, nobles stability, and allies protection, all while daring anyone to blink first. Rumors of rebellion didn't vanish overnight, but they paused long enough for everyone to remember. This was the boy who broke the sacred band at Chæronea. The skeptics who thought the kingdom might crumble now realized the stage wasn't set for collapse. It was set for Act Two, starring Alexander in the lead role. News traveled fast in Greece, faster than Philip's funeral procession. When word spread that the old king was gone, city-states like Athens and Thebes perked up like students realizing the teacher had left the classroom. "Freedom!" they cried, raising banners and sharpening spears, ready to test the nerves of the new boy king. Alexander, however, didn't come to class late. He marched south with terrifying speed, covering distances so quickly that rumors of his arrival often outran his army. The effect was electric. Towns that thought rebellion was fashionable suddenly rediscovered their loyalty before he even arrived. Alexander's response was equal parts theater and thunder. He didn't just send envoys, he showed up in full armor, flanked by his battle-hardened phalanx, reminding everyone he was Philip's son, with the attitude of Zeus's grandson. The uprisings fizzled not because rebels lost spirit, but because Alexander smothered their flames before they became wildfires. In a world where hesitation meant death, his speed and decisiveness made him more than a king. He was a storm in bronze greaves, and Greece quickly remembered why storms are best avoided. If Greece had hoped Alexander would blink, Thebes was the one that shoved its face too close to the lion's jaws. Believing rumors that the young king had died in the north, Thebes rose in rebellion, shouting slogans of freedom and sharpening their spears. It was bold, dramatic, and disastrously timed, because Alexander was very much alive and very much marching straight toward them. When his army surrounded Thebes, the city expected a negotiation. Instead, Alexander delivered a masterclass in deterrence. The Macedonian phalanx stormed the walls, cavalry crashed through the gates, and within days the proud city that once defied Persia lay in ruins. Alexander didn't just crush Thebes, he erased it from the map, sparing only temples and the house of the poet Pindar. The message was clear: challenge me and your city becomes a cautionary tale. Across Greece, rebellious whispers dried up faster than spilled wine in the sun. Athens trembled. Other city-states bowed, and everyone agreed that this boy king played empire like a thunder god with no sense of humor. By turning Thebes into rubble, Alexander built the foundation of unquestioned authority. After the smoking ruins of Thebes sent their message across Greece, Alexander turned his gaze inward. Crushing rebels was only half the job. Holding on to the crown required a more delicate performance. Inside Macedonia, the throne was still warm from Philip, and plenty of nobles thought they could keep it warmer themselves. Some whispered in banquet halls, others tested loyalty with coin and promises. Alexander, however, combined charm and menace like a master actor switching masks. One day he would host feasts, pouring wine with a smile. The next he would march into the council chamber in full armor, reminding everyone who had the army at his back. He reshuffled positions, clipped the wings of ambitious lords, and promoted those who pledged absolute loyalty. Olympias, ever the political sorceress, whispered in ears and secured allies with a mix of flattery and fear. By the time Alexander was done, the court had shifted, fewer plots, more obedience. The boy who had just burned Thebes now proved he could also rule the palace without burning it down, though everyone understood he wouldn't hesitate if pushed. After Thebes was reduced to ash and the Macedonian court firmly in his grasp, Alexander turned to the larger stage, the League of Corinth. This alliance of Greek states, once stitched together by Philip, was a fragile tapestry, beautiful in theory, full of loose threads in practice. Some city-states still grumbled about autonomy, others about tribute, but Alexander was not in the mood for sewing circles. He convened the League, standing tall like a conductor before an unruly orchestra. His message was simple: Macedonia leads, everyone else follows, or else. Yet he delivered it with a flair that mixed iron and honey. He praised Greek valor against Persia, invoked shared glory, and dangled promises of vengeance for Marathon and Thermopylae. At the same time, his troops were conveniently camped nearby, polishing spears in case anyone misunderstood the poetry. The result? City-states voted, not with enthusiasm, but with survival instinct, to reaffirm Alexander as their leader. The boy king was now officially hegemon of Greece, inheritor of his father's mantle. And unlike Philip, Alexander's eyes already glimmered with plans far beyond the Aegean. Alexander knew that crowns weren't held by gold alone. They were fastened by iron, sweat, and soldierly devotion. After taming Greece, he turned his attention to his real foundation, the army. These men had marched with Philip, but would they bleed for his son? Alexander made sure the answer was yes. He shared meals in camp, joked with veterans, and wasn't afraid to sling a shield and sweat alongside them in drills. To the phalanx, he was not just a king in silk sandals, but a comrade in bronze greaves. He rewarded loyalty with promotions, punished treachery without hesitation, and kept the treasury flowing with just enough spoils to keep morale fat and happy. Most of all, he dazzled them with his vision. Not endless skirmishes in the Balkans, but the grand prize, Persia, rich and ripe for conquest. For soldiers tired of petty wars, the promise of legendary glory was intoxicating. Step by step, he transformed the army into not just Philip's veterans, but Alexander's believers, an ironclad brotherhood ready to follow him past the edge of the known world. Kings who burn cities and drill armies still need one thing: friends in fancy robes. Alexander knew he couldn't rule with soldiers alone. The nobles and trusted companions were the glue that held the crown together. But Macedonian aristocrats were as prickly as porcupines at a banquet, full of pride, quick to gossip, and always calculating their advantage. Alexander handled them with a mix of carrot, stick, and well-placed wine cup. He made sure his closest circle, Hephaestion, Ptolemy, and a few others, felt like brothers, sharing not just power but jokes, hunts, and long nights of planning future conquests. For the rest of the nobility, he offered prestige, offices, and a chance to bask in the reflected glory of their young king. But he also made it very clear, loyalty was a lifetime subscription, and cancellations were not allowed. Through this balancing act, Alexander built a court that was both glittering and cautious, bound together by ambition and just enough fear. The boy king was now a maestro, keeping his nobles dancing in tune while preparing to lead them onto the world stage. Once the dust of rebellion had settled and the nobles were back in line, Alexander pulled out the blueprint that really made his eyes sparkle, his father's grand plan to invade Persia. Philip had dreamed of leading all Greece against the Persian Empire, and Alexander wasn't about to let that dream gather cobwebs. He summoned his generals and companions, unrolling maps across tables, stabbing at cities with his finger as though they were already prizes in his pocket. Some worried aloud about Persia's vast wealth and endless armies, but Alexander brushed them off with a grin. More treasure, more glory, more songs about me. He painted the campaign as a holy crusade, revenge for Marathon and Thermopylae, a chance for Greeks to turn the tables on their old enemy. And it worked. The idea of marching east didn't just feel like war, it felt like destiny. By tying his father's vision to his own, Alexander transformed the Persian campaign into a promise of immortality. His men would soon discover that when Alexander made plans, he wasn't sketching borders, he was redrawing the world itself. The Macedonian camp was buzzing like a beehive on fire. After crushing rebellions and reminding everyone who was boss, Alexander now had his troops dreaming of glory across the sea. The soldiers, once weary of endless Balkan skirmishes, were suddenly strutting like roosters, polishing their armor with extra shine as if the Persians would notice. Around the campfires, veterans boasted about the spoils they'd grab, while younger recruits swore they'd carve their names into history next to Achilles. Alexander fed this fever with fiery speeches, painting Persia not as an enemy, but as a banquet waiting to be devoured. He made them believe the gods themselves had already written their victory in the stars. The phalanx was no longer just an army. It had become a fan club with Alexander as its rock star frontman. When morale is this high, even the hardest march feels like a parade. And as drums echoed through the night, one thing was clear. These men weren't just ready for war, they were ready for legend. As the fires in the Macedonian camp died down and the last echoes of drums faded into the night, Alexander stood at the edge of his empire in the making, gazing eastward. The rebellions had been crushed, the nobles placated, and the soldiers transformed from grumblers into zealots hungry for glory. He had silenced doubters not just with victories, but with charisma that made people believe he wasn't simply Philip's son, he was something greater. Thebes lay in ruins as a warning. Greece was once more under the Macedonian banner, and the Persian Empire loomed like the ultimate prize. For Alexander, the choice was never whether to march, but only when. His youthful grin hinted at mischief, but his eyes burned with the certainty of destiny. Behind him, generals and companions whispered of risks and riches, but Alexander was already dreaming of Asia. The chapter of consolidation was closing, and the next page was not just war, but world domination. The boy king was ready to become a legend. The great adventure officially began as Alexander led his men across the sparkling waters of the Aegean Sea. To the soldiers, it felt less like a campaign and more like a student exchange program with swords. Goodbye, Greece. Hello, Asia. The young king, barely 20, strutted on deck with the swagger of someone who believed Poseidon himself was clearing the waves for him. The army, packed onto triremes and supply ships, grumbled about seasickness and cramped space, but their eyes shone with the promise of riches and glory. Behind Alexander's bravado was a sharp sense of history. This was the same sea the Persians had once tried to cross into Greece, and now he was reversing the play. Some joked that he wasn't just going east to fight Darius. He was going to return every arrow and insult Persia had ever sent. The Aegean wind carried more than sails. It carried destiny. As Asia's coastline drew nearer, Alexander tightened his crimson cloak, gave his trademark mischievous grin, and declared to his companions, "We're not here to visit, we're here to stay." The conquest of the Persian Empire had officially set sail. The first major clash of Alexander's campaign came at the Granicus River. Picture this: a young king with way too much confidence charging straight into a river, while Persian nobles on horseback waited on the opposite bank. Most generals would have said, "Let's camp and think this through." Alexander, however, preferred the approach of, "Why wait? Glory is drying on the shore." He led his cavalry directly into the water, splashing like a maniac, while his companions tried to keep up. The Persians, certain this reckless maneuver would drown the Macedonians, soon discovered that enthusiasm and good armor can actually carry a man across anything. The battle turned into chaos, horses slipping on wet rocks, lances clashing, and Alexander shining in the middle like a lightning bolt wrapped in bronze. Legend has it he was nearly killed but saved by a loyal officer who blocked a fatal strike. By the end, the Persians fled, leaving the field and their pride behind. For Alexander, Granicus wasn't just a victory, it was his flashy way of telling Darius, "Hey, your empire's front door's unlocked, and I just let myself in." After the roaring success at Granicus, Alexander didn't just sit back and sip wine. He pushed deeper into Asia Minor, presenting himself as a liberator of the Greek cities under Persian control. For the locals, it was like your older cousin finally showing up to beat the neighborhood bully. The cities, weary of Persian satraps and their endless taxes, welcomed him with garlands, cheers, and possibly a few awkwardly choreographed dances. Alexander, always the showman, played the role perfectly. Gracious speeches about freedom, lowering some taxes, and making sure temples got a fresh coat of respect. But of course, behind the liberator smile was the ambition of a conqueror who knew that every cheering crowd meant more soldiers, more resources, and more legitimacy for his growing empire. Some towns were genuinely thrilled. Others just hoped to avoid becoming the next Thebes. Either way, Alexander's reputation spread faster than gossip at a royal banquet. With each city that switched sides, the Persian grip loosened, and Alexander's dream of toppling Darius crept closer to reality. Liberation, after all, was the friendliest mask conquest could wear. The showdown at Issus was like the heavyweight match of the ancient world. Alexander, the ambitious young contender, versus Darius III, the reigning king of the Persian Empire. Except the battlefield was a cramped coastal plain, which turned the Persian numerical advantage into a logistical nightmare. Picture thousands of troops bumping elbows while Darius tried to look majestic in his royal chariot. Alexander, spotting the perfect chance, led his cavalry in a wedge formation straight at the Persian center like a human spear. The fighting was brutal, spears shattering, shields clashing, soldiers tumbling into the mud. But in the middle of it all, Alexander stood out, glittering like a bronze comet with a very sharp point. Meanwhile, Darius, realizing the situation was less imperial triumph and more run while you still can, abandoned his troops and fled. The Persians panicked, the Macedonians cheered, and history noted this as the moment Alexander went from promising prince to nightmare neighbor for every empire. Issus wasn't just a battle, it was a declaration. Alexander wasn't visiting Persia, he was auditioning to take over. After Issus, Alexander didn't just walk away with victory, he walked away with Darius's entire royal family. Talk about awkward family reunions. The Persian king had fled so quickly that his mother, wife, and daughters were left behind, like luggage forgotten at the airport. The Persian queen mother, used to being treated like royalty, suddenly found herself staring at a muddy Macedonian camp and wondering if this was really happening. To everyone's surprise, Alexander treated them with remarkable respect. No insults, no humiliations, not even a sarcastic, "Your son ran pretty fast." Instead, he assured them that their dignity was safe, even as he subtly reminded them whose tent they were now sitting in. For Alexander, this wasn't just kindness, it was strategy. By showing restraint, he made himself look like a noble king in front of both Greeks and Persians. The propaganda basically wrote itself. See? He beats you in battle and wins your family's loyalty. Meanwhile, somewhere far away, Darius was probably writing the world's most uncomfortable apology letter. Alexander had claimed not just land, but the ultimate bargaining chips, the royal hostages of Persia. If Alexander's conquest were a video game, the siege of Tyre would be the ultimate boss level. Tyre was a wealthy island city with walls so high they made other fortresses look like sandcastles. Most generals would shrug and move on, but Alexander, he saw it as a personal challenge. First, he ordered a massive causeway to be built across the sea, basically turning his army into ancient construction workers. The Tyrians mocked from the walls, tossing insults and occasionally flaming projectiles, convinced the land bridge idea was ridiculous. But slowly, stone by stone, Alexander's bridge crept forward like the world's angriest mole. Then came the siege towers, taller than the walls themselves, bristling with archers and catapults. After 7 brutal months of sweat, smoke, and stubbornness, the Macedonians broke through. The city that believed it was untouchable suddenly realized Alexander had just rewritten the rulebook on impossible. The fall of Tyre was brutal, but it showcased Alexander's obsession. No obstacle too big, no city too secure. To him, walls weren't barriers, they were invitations. After smashing through Phoenicia, Alexander turned south and marched into Egypt. Probably the only campaign where people didn't throw spears at him, but garlands instead. Egyptians, weary of Persian rule, welcomed him like a long-lost cousin, who also happened to come with an army. Priests in Memphis wasted no time, declaring him pharaoh, which meant Alexander, a Macedonian with a rather thick accent, was suddenly considered the living son of the god Amun. Imagine the ceremony: golden crowns, incense everywhere, priests chanting, and Alexander nodding like, "Yep, this tracks." He even made a pilgrimage to the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, braving desert sands to ask the ultimate question, "Am I divine enough?" The oracle's cryptic answer, classic style, seemed to confirm his godlike status. Alexander left Egypt not just as a conqueror, but as a ruler who fit neatly into their religious system. Half warlord, half deity, and maybe half tourist. It was a brilliant PR stunt, proving he could conquer with swords or smiles, whichever the situation required. Freshly crowned as pharaoh, Alexander wasn't content with statues and ceremonies. He wanted a city that screamed legacy. Thus, Alexandria was born, not from a humble village, but from his grand vision sketched in the sand with a soldier's spear. Imagine him pacing along the Mediterranean coast, cloak flapping dramatically, explaining to bemused engineers how this city would become the bridge between Greece and Egypt, a beacon of trade, culture, and learning. Of course, the locals probably thought, another ruler with grand plans. But Alexander was dead serious. He ordered wide streets, harbors for ships, marketplaces, and, because why not, a library meant to store all the world's knowledge. It was the kind of over-the-top project that said, "I'm not just conquering, I'm curating civilization. While Alexander didn't stick around long enough to see Alexandria finished, the idea alone turned into one of the most iconic cities in history. Proving he didn't just swing swords, he also built empires with ink, stone, and flair. The showdown at Gaugamela was less a battle and more a blockbuster finale. Picture Alexander squaring off against Darius III, whose army looked like it could fill a stadium, and then some. Chariots with scythes, elephants that probably wondered why they were invited, and rows upon rows of Persian troops. Against this spectacle, Alexander brought his trademark strategy, brains over brawn. Instead of charging head-on, he played mind games, stretching the battlefield, luring Darius into panic mode. At the decisive moment, Alexander and his cavalry punched a hole straight through the Persian center like a hot knife through butter. Darius, true to form, bolted from the scene in his royal chariot, making his second dramatic exit. The Persians, despite their numbers, crumbled in chaos. What looked like an impossible challenge turned into Alexander's greatest triumph. The victory at Gaugamela didn't just win him the battle, it handed him the Persian Empire on a golden platter, proving that sometimes a sharp mind beats even the biggest army. With the dust of Gaugamela settling, Alexander stood not just as a victor, but as the new master of Asia. From the Aegean to the heart of Persia, his empire stretched wider than anyone could have imagined when he first set foot across the sea. The young Macedonian, who once wrangled horses and debated philosophy, now wore the crown of a conqueror, holding the fate of countless peoples in his hands. His soldiers, still buzzing from their impossible triumphs, looked at him as if he were half man, half god. The Persians, stunned by their king's repeated flights, had no choice but to bend to the new order. Yet Alexander, instead of slowing down, was already scheming the next step, eastward, beyond Persia, where new horizons beckon. The chapter closes with the image of a man who had taken down the greatest empire of his age and treated it like a stepping stone. Asia was his, but in Alexander's restless mind, it was merely the beginning. After the thunder of Gaugamela faded, Alexander marched into the heart of Persia like a man entering his long-awaited inheritance. Babylon, the city of wonders with its legendary walls and hanging gardens, opened its gates without a fight, as if it had been expecting him all along. The locals must have thought, better to cheer this Macedonian than to be flattened by his phalanx. Alexander, ever the showman, paraded through the grand boulevards, soaking in the awe of a city that had dazzled empires for centuries. From there, he set his eyes on Persepolis, the jewel of Persian civilization, brimming with palaces and treasures fit for a dozen kings. The Macedonian soldiers gawked at halls adorned with golden reliefs, wondering if their paychecks might finally come on time. For Alexander, capturing these cities wasn't just about treasure, it was about legitimacy. By seizing the very heart of Persia, he wasn't just a conqueror anymore. He was making himself heir to an empire that once dominated the known world. Persepolis, the jewel of Persia, didn't fall to an army. It fell to a bonfire that became the most debated party accident in history. After a night of feasting and wine, someone, maybe Alexander, maybe one of his tipsy friends, thought it would be a grand idea to torch the palace as a symbolic gesture of revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece. Flames licked the carved columns, and golden halls turned into glowing furnaces. Soldiers stumbled around, some pretending to be firefighters with buckets, others cheering as if it were a festival. Alexander himself was said to have joined in, holding a torch and smirking, half politician, half prankster. But by dawn, when the hangovers arrived, everyone realized they might have accidentally destroyed one of the greatest cultural treasures of the ancient world. Historians still argue, was it deliberate payback, a drunken mistake, or Alexander's way of saying housewarming parties should be unforgettable? Either way, Persepolis burned into legend, literally. While Persepolis still smoldered, King Darius III was busy perfecting the ancient art of disappearing. First, he sprinted eastward with what remained of his dignity and army, hoping to regroup. But his generals, tired of losing and perhaps unimpressed by his running skills, decided to speed things up. In a twist worthy of a tragic comedy, Darius was betrayed and assassinated by his own satrap Bessus. Imagine a king fleeing in his royal chariot, only to be stabbed by the very people meant to guard him. It's like hiring bodyguards who also moonlight as robbers. When Alexander finally reached the scene, he didn't get the glorious showdown he probably expected. Instead, he found the Persian king abandoned, wounded, and dying in a cart. Rather than gloating, Alexander gave him royal funerary honors, as if to say, "You weren't a great enemy, but at least you were consistent in losing." The death of Darius closed a chapter for Persia, but opened the door for Alexander to claim the title of Asia's supreme ruler. With Darius III out of the picture, Alexander wasted no time stepping into the spotlight. Standing tall in his gleaming armor, he declared himself King of Asia, a title that sounded both majestic and slightly like he was auditioning for a talent show. To the Macedonian troops, it was proof their endless marching and bruised feet were paying off. To the Persians, it was a case of, well, he beat our king, so guess he's the new one. Alexander played the role with flair, adopting Persian customs just enough to look like he belonged, but not so much that his own soldiers thought he'd gone native. He even started wearing royal robes, mixing Greek swagger with Persian glitter, like an ancient fashion influencer testing out new outfits. Of course, this wasn't just vanity, it was politics. By taking the crown, Alexander signaled that he wasn't just a conqueror passing through, he intended to rule. Asia now had a new king, and he was young, ambitious, and clearly addicted to expanding his empire. Having crowned himself King of Asia, Alexander wasn't about to sit still polishing his new title. Instead, he packed up the army and pointed eastward, into the lands of Bactria and Sogdiana. These weren't just distant names on a map. They were rugged territories with mountains that looked like they had been designed specifically to give marching armies blisters. Alexander's men grumbled, of course, wondering if their general had a secret hobby of collecting impossible terrains. But Alexander thrived on challenges. Every valley and fortress seemed like another chance to prove that the world had not yet invented a wall high enough or a garrison stubborn enough to stop him. His march east was less a leisurely stroll and more a treadmill set to maximum difficulty. Yet as always, he kept spirits up with his charisma and the occasional promise of loot. For the young king, conquering Persia wasn't enough. He wanted to plant Macedonian flags on every peak that dared to rise in the east. If Alexander thought conquering Persia was the grand finale, Central Asia quickly reminded him that sequels can be even tougher. In Bactria and Sogdiana, resistance wasn't just fierce, it was personal. Local leaders knew every cave, every mountain pass, and seemed to pop up like mushrooms after rain the moment Alexander turned his back. His soldiers groaned that they hadn't signed up for endless guerrilla warfare in landscapes where goats had better footing than men. Alexander, however, refused to quit. He adapted, building forts, marrying local customs with Macedonian discipline, and personally chasing rebels through mountains like a man who thought rest was a myth. This was no glamorous parade. It was survival, grit, in a never-ending chess match against foes who refused to be checkmated. Yet in this fiery cauldron, Alexander's legend only grew. He wasn't just the conqueror of kings, but the man who could wrestle mountains and still come out shouting victory. After years of chasing rebels through mountains and deserts, Alexander decided diplomacy could sometimes be quicker than endless sword fights. Enter Roxana, the daughter of a powerful Sogdian noble, whose beauty was said to rival the moonlight on snow. The marriage was part politics, part passion, though his soldiers joked it was also part exhaustion, since conquering local hearts seemed easier than scaling more cliffs. For Alexander, marrying Roxana meant more than love. It was a clever move to secure loyalty in a region that had stubbornly resisted him. To the locals, it was a sign that this foreign conqueror was willing to tie his fate with theirs. The wedding itself was grand, but also a little chaotic. Macedonian warriors trying to dance local steps, while Sogdian nobles stared at their new son-in-law with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. In this playful mix of cultures, Alexander proved that sometimes empire building wasn't just about battles. It could also involve wedding vows and awkward dance moves. As if conquering kingdoms wasn't enough, Alexander also had a strange hobby, founding cities and naming them all Alexandria. It was like he wanted to make sure no future traveler could ever forget his name. By the time he reached Central Asia, new Alexandrias popped up like mushrooms after rain, each one a mix of Greek temples, local markets, and homes for his soldiers who were too tired to keep marching. To the Macedonians, it was proof their king was thinking long-term. To the locals, it was probably confusing. Wait, is this Alexandria number 6 or number 7? Alexander, of course, imagined these cities as eternal monuments to his glory. But the playful side of history shows how empire building often involved as much urban planning as sword swinging. While armies rested, architects drew maps, and merchants argued over stall spaces. In the end, these Alexandrias became stepping stones of culture, trade, and stories. Tiny sparks of Greek life scattered far from home, making sure Alexander's influence traveled farther than even his horses could gallop. By now, you would think Alexander had conquered enough. But no, our restless king glanced east and decided, why stop when there's India waiting? With his army already weary from years of marching, he promised them rivers of gold, exotic wonders, and maybe even elephants, because horses just weren't dramatic enough. The soldiers groaned, their sandals worn thin, but Alexander's charisma worked like magic. Somehow he made endless deserts sound like adventure vacations. As the army trudged forward, they swapped jokes. Next city, let me guess. Alexandria? The idea of India wasn't just about territory. To Alexander, it was the edge of the known world, the place where myth blurred into geography. Every step eastward felt like walking into legend itself. Whether his men liked it or not, their king was dragging them toward the horizon, convinced that beyond each mountain lay the next chapter of greatness. And so, with grumbles, laughter, and an occasional curse, the Macedonian caravan pressed on toward India, the land that would test not just their spears, but their patience. At last, Alexander and his weary troops reached what felt like the very edge of the world. The maps grew fuzzy, the myths louder, and the soldiers began to wonder if they'd soon meet monsters with dog heads or rivers made of honey. To Alexander, this was not exhaustion. It was destiny knocking at the door. He stood tall, declaring that they had reached the boundary of Greek knowledge, as if Poseidon himself had drawn a line in the sand. The men, however, were less impressed. One muttered, "Great. Now even the gods are union leaders asking for a break." Still, Alexander's charisma kept them moving forward. Standing at the frontier, he looked out with eyes blazing, imagining worlds beyond, while his soldiers looked at their blistered feet and imagined sandals with better padding. It was a comical contrast, the king dreaming of immortality while the army dreamed of naps. And so ended this chapter. Alexander staring boldly into the unknown, convinced the horizon was just another throne waiting for him. The march into India began with a massive obstacle, the Hindu Kush Mountains. These were not friendly hills with scenic trails, but towering giants that seemed to laugh at every step. Alexander naturally declared it was just another staircase to glory. His soldiers, however, muttered that it felt more like climbing the roof of the world with rocks for breakfast. The icy winds whipped their faces, turning proud Macedonian warriors into shivering bundles of cloaks, while mules slipped comically on narrow paths, sending supplies tumbling into the abyss. Yet even in this misery, Alexander pushed forward with his trademark determination, encouraging his men with speeches about destiny and greatness. To the soldiers, destiny sounded suspiciously like frostbite. Still, the march continued, and somehow, between sliding on ice and dodging falling rocks, the army managed to crawl over the peaks. When they finally descended, battered and half-frozen, the men sighed in relief while Alexander triumphantly declared that nothing, not even the mountains, could block their path to conquest. Descending from the frozen peaks, Alexander's army entered the lush yet unpredictable lands of India. Gone were the icy winds. Now the men faced jungles buzzing with insects the size of daggers and rivers that seemed to laugh as soldiers tried to cross. Waiting for them were the Indian city-states, each ruled by kings who were not particularly thrilled to see an armed Greek housewarming party. Alexander, ever the charmer, sent envoys offering friendship, which usually translated to surrender politely or prepare for a very loud battle. Some rulers submitted quickly, preferring diplomacy over Macedonian spears, while others rallied their warriors with elephants and colorful banners, eager to test these invaders. The soldiers grumbled about the endless surprises, first snow, now giant mosquitoes and strange spices in the food. But Alexander's energy never flagged. He reminded his men that each conquest was a step toward immortality, though to the soldiers it mostly felt like a step toward another blister. Still, the march pressed on, deeper into a land where every sunrise promised both riches and resistance. At the banks of the Hydaspes River, Alexander faced a challenge unlike any before: King Porus and his towering war elephants. The Macedonians, who once thought horses were scary enough, now stared at creatures that looked like mountains with tusks. The elephants trumpeted so loudly that even the bravest soldiers considered pretending to be sick. Alexander, however, was thrilled. Finally, an opponent who brought animals the size of fortresses to battle. The clash was chaotic: elephants charging, soldiers scattering, and horses neighing in protest as if to say, "We didn't sign up for this." Alexander's tactical brilliance shone through. While Porus relied on brute force, Alexander flanked cleverly, turning chaos into opportunity. His men darted between the elephants, cutting off riders and attacking the flanks. Yet even as victory loomed, the sheer power of Porus's defense made it feel less like a fight and more like wrestling with thunder itself. In the end, the Macedonians triumphed, but the battle left Alexander both impressed and exhausted, realizing that conquering India would not just be about swords and strategy, it would also be about surviving pachyderm stampedes. After the dust settled at the Hydaspes, Alexander came face to face with King Porus, who, despite being defeated, stood tall, literally, since he was said to be over 2 meters tall. While most conquered kings begged for mercy, Porus looked Alexander straight in the eye and simply declared, "Treat me like a king." That boldness made Alexander chuckle. Finally, someone with enough confidence to match his own ego. Instead of chains, Porus received respect. Alexander not only spared his life, but also allowed him to continue ruling, this time as an ally. The soldiers watched in disbelief, whispering, "Wait, we fought elephants for this guy, and now he's on our side?" But Alexander knew better. Keeping Porus close was smarter than fighting him again. The meeting became legendary, a story where admiration triumphed over vengeance. In fact, it was one of those rare moments where Alexander's ambition took a coffee break, replaced by genuine admiration for a man who fought with honor and dignity, even if his elephants left quite a mess on the battlefield. After his dramatic showdown with Porus, Alexander did not waste time celebrating with Mango lassies. Instead, he got back to business, establishing new provinces in India. His idea was simple: if you can't conquer the entire subcontinent in one go, start by planting Macedonian flags and bureaucracy. He reorganized the territories, installed governors, some Greek, some local nobles, and left garrisons to remind everyone who was boss. The soldiers grumbled, "Great, we traveled thousands of miles to watch Alexander play SimCity." But Alexander was strategic. He knew long-lasting control required more than victories on the battlefield. He founded towns, collected taxes, and spread Greek culture like a traveling salesman who refused to take no for an answer. For the locals, it was a mix of fascination and annoyance. On one hand, shiny new Greek theaters. On the other, taxes that could make a farmer cry. Yet Alexander's energy was unstoppable. Even his enemies admitted, this young Macedonian wasn't just a conqueror, he was also an empire builder, with a flair for mixing politics, urban planning, and relentless enthusiasm. By this point, Alexander's men had marched across deserts, climbed impossible mountains, and wrestled with war elephants. They were tired. No, beyond tired. Their sandals were falling apart, their beards had gone feral, and their patience for one more inspirational speech from Alexander was thinner than papyrus. When the young king excitedly pointed eastward and declared, "Beyond lies even greater glory," the army looked at him as if he had just suggested a group jog after an all-night drinking party. Morale collapsed like a sandcastle hit by a wave. Soldiers muttered, "We've conquered enough. Let's just go home and open a tavern." Even Alexander's closest generals exchanged glances that screamed, "Not it!" For the first time, the man who had convinced thousands to follow him to the ends of the earth faced something he couldn't outsmart: sheer exhaustion. The army staged what was essentially a polite mutiny, no swords drawn, just crossed arms and stubborn silence. Alexander, who had bent kings and empires to his will, now found himself defeated by the most dangerous enemy of all, collective burnout. Alexander stood before his army, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with ambition. He wanted to go farther east to chase horizons no Greek had ever seen. But his soldiers stood firm, shaking their heads with the collective stubbornness of men who had marched one step too many. For once, Alexander's fiery speeches, full of promises of glory and riches, landed with a dull thud. The men were more interested in their worn-out sandals than his dreams of conquest. Realizing he had been outnumbered, not on the battlefield but in sheer willpower, Alexander sighed dramatically, like a child forced to put away his favorite toy. He agreed to turn back, though he made sure to frame it as an act of grand strategy rather than capitulation. His soldiers cheered, not for more glory, but at the thought of heading home to wine, families, and possibly sandals that didn't fall apart every 10 miles. Alexander may have commanded kings, but on this day, he learned the hard truth. Sometimes the greatest conqueror is compromise. The march back home was supposed to be a relief, but Alexander's army quickly realized that the Gedrosian desert was less a path and more a cruel cosmic prank. The sun blazed like it had a personal vendetta, the sand swallowed boots and tempers, and water was scarcer than philosophers who agreed with each other. Soldiers trudged along with tongues hanging out, muttering curses that could blister the air. Alexander, ever the drama king, marched proudly in front, refusing extra rations, sharing the misery like a proper hero, or at least trying to look heroic while covered in dust. Supplies ran low, camels gave up halfway, and even the usually indomitable Macedonian spirit began to sag like an old wineskin. Yet despite fainting soldiers and constant complaints about blistered feet, the army pushed on, driven by pride, stubbornness, and probably the fantasy of cool wine waiting back in Babylon. If conquering the world was about grit, this desert reminded them it was also about sheer stubborn survival. The Gedrosian desert had already drained the spirit of Alexander's men, but the true toll became clear in the aftermath. Thousands of soldiers lay buried beneath the sands, their armor now useless souvenirs for vultures. Supplies had vanished, wagons were abandoned like broken toys, and even precious treasures looted from Persia had to be dumped in the desert to lighten the load. Alexander, with his stubborn pride, tried to keep morale afloat. But it was hard to give heroic speeches when everyone was too dehydrated to cheer. Some men cursed the gods, others cursed Alexander directly, though not too loudly, while officers tried to hold together units that looked more like ghostly parades than an army. The once proud conquerors who had faced war elephants and kings now found themselves humbled by heat, hunger, and exhaustion. The lesson was painfully obvious. Sometimes the greatest enemy isn't a rival empire, but the merciless indifference of nature. And the desert had just claimed victory without lifting a sword. Alexander's dream of conquering the entire world came to a very human halt. Not on the battlefield, but in the collective groans of his exhausted soldiers. After years of marching, endless battles, and deserts that seemed designed by angry gods, the army finally said, "Enough is enough." No amount of fiery speeches, promises of glory, or visions of new empires could convince them to take another step deeper into the unknown. For the first time, Alexander, the unstoppable, was forced to stop, not by enemy spears, but by his men's sheer exhaustion. He reluctantly turned back, carrying not only treasures and victories, but also the realization that even the greatest conquerors are limited by the endurance of those who follow them. The chapter closes with a bittersweet image. Alexander, still young and burning with ambition, staring into the horizon, knowing that the world was larger than his army's strength. The mighty conqueror of empires was, in the end, checked by the simplest truth: human fatigue. Returning to Babylon, Alexander faced a problem bigger than any Persian army, managing the massive empire he had stitched together like an overambitious quilt. Imagine a patchwork of Greeks, Persians, Egyptians, and countless other peoples, each with their own customs, languages, and opinions about who made the best wine. Alexander, ever the micromanager with grand visions, set about reorganizing this sprawling realm. He appointed satraps, established new administrative centers, and demanded reports as if he had invented ancient Excel spreadsheets. His goal wasn't just to maintain order, but to make his empire feel less like a chaotic conquest and more like a functioning machine, or at least something that didn't collapse the moment he turned his back. While his generals were secretly dreaming of early retirement, Alexander was sketching maps, redrawing borders, and issuing decrees at lightning speed. It was the first step in transforming a collection of conquered lands into a unified empire, though not without groans from those who thought they had signed up for glory, not paperwork. After tightening the screws of administration, Alexander turned his attention to something even more ambitious. Blending cultures like a master chef mixing two bold flavors. His dream was to fuse Greek ideals with the richness of the East, creating a hybrid empire where philosophers might debate alongside Persian astrologers, and hoplites could sip wine with Babylonian nobles. To push this idea, Alexander encouraged intermarriage, adopted Persian court customs, and even started dressing in Eastern robes, though some Macedonian soldiers grumbled that their king now looked more like a fashion model than a warrior. Banquets featured Greek plays performed under Mesopotamian stars, while Persian musicians added exotic flair. It was Alexander's way of turning a military conquest into something that resembled a cultural festival. Of course, not everyone applauded. To some Greeks, this was sacrilege. To some Persians, it was suspiciously Greek-flavored. But Alexander, ever the visionary, brushed aside complaints with the confidence of a man who believed he could mix oil and water and somehow get wine instead. To cement his grand experiment of East meets West, Alexander orchestrated one of the most extravagant weddings in history, the mass marriage at Susa. Imagine hundreds of couples lined up in perfect formation, like a royal conveyor belt of brides and grooms. Alexander himself married Statira, daughter of Darius III, while generously handing out Persian princesses and noblewomen to his officers as if they were prizes at a festival. The scene was part love story, part political theater, and part awkward family reunion. Greek generals who preferred their simple Macedonian wives now had to smile through ceremonies with elaborate Persian customs, complete with gold embroidery and endless incense smoke. Meanwhile, Persian nobles tried not to look too smug as their daughters became linked to conquerors of the West. For Alexander, it was the ultimate symbolic fusion, love as a diplomatic tool. Of course, whether these couples found romance or simply confusion is another story. But for that day, Susa looked less like a battlefield and more like the set of an over-the-top wedding comedy, starring Alexander as both groom and director. The honeymoon phase of Alexander's cultural experiment did not last long. After the grand wedding at Susa, his Macedonian soldiers began to grumble louder than an army marching on empty stomachs. They had followed him through deserts, rivers, and elephants, but now he was asking them to bow Persian style and wear flowing robes. For warriors who prided themselves on rough cloaks and straightforward manners, this felt less like honor and more like cosplay. In Babylon's courtyards, soldiers whispered complaints, rolling their eyes at the new customs Alexander tried to impose. Some joked that soon they'd have to swap their shields for silk fans. Alexander, ever the showman, insisted that blending Greek and Eastern traditions was the key to ruling his vast empire. But the soldiers muttered that he was starting to look more like a Persian king than their Macedonian lion. The tension simmered like a pot about to boil over. Loyalty was still there, but now it came with a side of grumpy sarcasm. The dream of unity was inspiring, but for the rank and file, it was also itchy, sweaty, and terribly undignified. The laughter and squabbles of Alexander's camp suddenly fell silent when tragedy struck. Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend, advisor, and perhaps the only person who could tell him he was wrong without losing his head, died unexpectedly. For years, the two had been inseparable, like two halves of the same sword. Hephaestion was not just a general, but Alexander's sounding board, his companion in victories and hangovers alike. Some joked he was the empire's unofficial vice-king. His sudden death was like ripping out the strings from Alexander's lyre. What was left was a hollow sound. The great conqueror, who had stared down elephants and empires, was now floored by grief. Soldiers whispered in disbelief, saying it was the first time they'd seen their king lose a battle, and this time, to fate. The palace halls, once buzzing with plans and debates, now echoed with the silence of loss. Without Hephaestion's steadying presence, Alexander seemed more fragile, like a lion suddenly missing its roar. The empire was vast, but for Alexander, the world had shrunk into an unbearable emptiness. After Hephaestion's death, Alexander's grief became a storm that refused to pass. The conqueror, who once thundered across continents, now wandered Babylon like a shadow of himself. He ordered enormous funeral games, sacrificed to the gods, and even demanded that the entire empire join him in mourning. Some whispered he was trying to deify his friend, while others muttered that the king had lost touch with reality. Alexander, usually brimming with plans and restless energy, now spent days staring into nothing, drinking heavily, and talking to Hephaestion as if he were still alive. His soldiers, once accustomed to his fiery speeches, now saw him pacing the palace halls like a restless lion in a cage, growling at fate itself. Playful rumor had it that the greatest empire builder in history had been toppled not by armies or assassins, but by heartbreak. Babylon, the bustling capital, now felt like a mausoleum, echoing with a grief so deep it unsettled even the bravest veterans. For the first time, Alexander's legendary drive seemed to falter, as if one missing heartbeat had unstrung the bow of the world's most ambitious archer. Even in the depths of grief, Alexander's restless ambition refused to stay buried. Barely had the morning fires for Hephaestion cooled when the king began plotting again. This time, an audacious conquest of Arabia. While others might take a holiday after carving up half the known world, Alexander looked at the map and said, that desert looks tempting. Plans buzzed through Babylon. Fleets to be built, supply lines to be secured, cities to spring from sand like mirages. Advisors scribbled nervously, knowing that for Alexander, a casual idea often meant a new capital city or a campaign that would exhaust every soldier. The courtiers whispered, was it brilliance or madness? The soldiers, still weary from India, rolled their eyes. Apparently retirement wasn't in the royal vocabulary. But Alexander's excitement was infectious. He spoke of Arabia not as barren wasteland, but as a treasure chest waiting to be opened. The desert, he promised, would be his next playground. Babylon itself seemed to tremble with anticipation, caught between admiration and exhaustion for a king who simply didn't know how to stop. Just as Alexander's Arabian dream was starting to take shape, fate threw in a plot twist worthy of a Greek tragedy. In Babylon, amidst feasts and plans, the king suddenly fell ill. At first, everyone thought it was just fatigue. After all, conquering the world is not exactly a 9-to-5 job. But when the usually unstoppable Alexander struggled to lift his wine cup, whispers filled the palace halls. Was it poison, a fever, or simply the toll of years of nonstop campaigning? The mighty warrior who once faced elephants without flinching now wrestled with chills, sweats, and a body that refused to obey him. His generals hovered nervously, pretending not to argue about succession while side-eyeing one another. Meanwhile, Alexander tried to brush it off, insisting he was fine, though his pale face and weakened voice said otherwise. Babylon, the jewel of his empire, turned into a giant sick room, where anxiety grew heavier with each passing day. For the first time, the man who conquered half the known world seemed trapped by an enemy he couldn't outwit, his own failing health. At just 32 years old, the unstoppable conqueror finally met a mystery no sword could cut through. Alexander's death in Babylon was as dramatic as his life, sudden, shocking, and ripe for endless gossip. Some swore it was poison slipped into his wine by jealous generals. Others claimed it was a fever, the punishment of overwork and endless campaigning. And a few whispered about divine retribution, because apparently the gods didn't appreciate humans trying to outdo them. Whatever the cause, the effect was undeniable. One moment, the world had a leader who thought continents were collectible toys, and the next, his soldiers were left staring at an empty throne. The palace filled with chaos. Generals bickered, courtiers panicked, and servants pretended to dust columns while eavesdropping on succession debates. The once invincible Alexander now lay still, wrapped in royal garments, his face calm as if even death had been conquered with a smirk. His empire, however, was anything but calm, teetering on the edge of fragmentation the moment its glue disappeared. Alexander's death didn't just silence a man, it left a vacuum the size of an empire. Imagine dropping a rock into a pond, except this pond was the known world, and the splash sent shockwaves from Greece to India. His generals, the so-called diadochi, suddenly found themselves in a giant board game where the prize was entire continents. They squabbled, bargained, and occasionally stabbed each other in the back, sometimes literally, while courtiers and advisors scrambled to pick sides faster than you can say succession crisis. Soldiers who had once marched under one banner now argued over whose banner looked cooler. Cities that had been united under Alexander's charisma found themselves wondering who exactly was in charge. The man who dreamed of conquering the world had left behind a puzzle no one could solve neatly. It was chaos wrapped in royal drama, sprinkled with ambition and baked in uncertainty. Yet one truth stood tall. Alexander might have died, but his legend was very much alive, larger than the empire he had built. With Alexander gone, his generals, known as the diadochi, turned the empire into the ancient world's messiest reality show. Instead of calmly deciding who would take the throne, they erupted into shouting matches and plotting sessions that made family dinners look like peaceful tea parties. Each general claimed to be the rightful heir, armed not with a will or a crown, but with armies, egos, and an alarming number of daggers. Ptolemy eyed Egypt like it was prime beachfront property. Seleucus dreamed of ruling the East, and Antigonus thought Macedonia was his birthright. Meanwhile, Cassander busied himself with old grudges and an attitude of, "I deserve this more than you." The court became a circus of alliances made in the morning and broken by dinner. Soldiers were bribed, cities promised protection, and even Alexander's poor family members became bargaining chips. What was once a unified empire now looked like a giant piñata that everyone wanted to smash open. The scramble for power wasn't just about territory, it was about legacy, pride, and who could shout loudest while waving a sword. And so began the wars of succession, where ambition trumped loyalty and chaos ruled the stage. The once mighty empire of Alexander didn't just split, it shattered like a dropped amphora, scattering kingdoms across the map. Each general picked up a piece and called it a throne, as if playing a very aggressive game of musical chairs. Ptolemy snatched Egypt, Seleucus carved out the vast east, Antigonus eyed Asia Minor with the hunger of a man at a feast, and Cassander clung to Macedonia like a stubborn cat refusing to leave the couch. What had been a united realm now resembled a messy jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces and several duplicate corners. The so-called successors dressed themselves in royal cloaks, crowned their heads and declared themselves kings, though their crowns sometimes looked suspiciously like helmets with extra glitter. The people, of course, didn't get a say. They simply woke up one morning to realize they now lived in a new kingdom. Same city, new tax collector. From the Mediterranean to the far reaches of Asia, Alexander's dream of unity dissolved into a patchwork of rival dynasties. Each claimed to carry his legacy, but in truth, they were more interested in proving who could grab the biggest slice of imperial pie. Thus began the age of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Among the scramble for Alexander's shattered empire, Ptolemy played his cards with the slyness of a seasoned gambler. While others fought over Asia like children squabbling for the last cookie, he calmly sailed south and claimed Egypt, the golden breadbasket of the ancient world. Ptolemy was no fool. He knew pyramids didn't just look cool on postcards. They came with fertile land and an economy that practically ran on sunshine and Nile floods. Instead of chasing endless wars, he settled down like a man who had finally found the best seat in the tavern. Soon he styled himself as Pharaoh, mixing Greek wit with Egyptian god-king pomp. To the locals, it must have looked like Zeus himself had decided to cosplay as Osiris. Ptolemy even started building libraries, temples, and monuments, making Egypt both a fortress and a cultural hub. In a world where Alexander's successors tried to outdo each other with conquest, Ptolemy simply said, "No thanks, I'll take the Nile, some pyramids, and eternal bragging rights." Thus, from the chaos, the Ptolemaic dynasty was born, a dynasty that would last nearly 300 years and eventually give us Cleopatra, history's most famous queen of eyeliner. While Ptolemy was busy sunbathing by the Nile, Seleucus was playing the long game in Asia. Once just another general in Alexander's entourage, Seleucus turned opportunist extraordinaire. After dodging rival generals like a contestant on an ancient reality show, he seized control of a massive chunk of territory stretching from Mesopotamia to Persia, even nudging toward India. To manage this oversized empire, Seleucus had to act less like a warrior and more like a CEO running an unruly startup. His solution? Founding new cities faster than a kid collecting Pokemon cards, most of them named, surprise, Seleucia. The locals must have been baffled. Wait, which Seleucia are we marching to again? But Seleucus was clever. He kept the Persian administration intact, sprinkled Greek culture on top, and created one of the most enduring Hellenistic kingdoms. With elephants from India as his secret weapons and diplomats in every corner, Seleucus didn't just grab land, he built a machine of power that would last centuries. In the chaos of Alexander's fractured empire, Seleucus proved you didn't need to swing the biggest sword. Sometimes it was enough to build the biggest map. While Seleucus was building his empire in the east, the western half of Alexander's world became the playground of two heavyweights, Antigonus and Cassander. Antigonus, nicknamed the One-Eyed, looked like a veteran gladiator who had seen it all, because he literally had, except for that missing eye. He planted himself in Asia Minor and eyed Greece hungrily, plotting to be the new Alexander, without all the inconvenient dying at 32. Cassander, on the other hand, was more the scheming type, the kind of guy who probably color-coded his war plans and sharpened his daggers while humming ominous tunes. Taking control of Macedonia and Greece, he turned Athens and the other city-states into reluctant tenants of his real estate empire. Together, these two tried to juggle diplomacy, war, and ego contests big enough to shake Olympus. Their rivalry turned Greece into a chessboard where cities were pawns and armies were knights, except instead of calm moves, everything was loud, messy, and usually ended in fires. In this slice of chaos, Antigonus dreamed of reunification, while Cassander seemed happy enough to keep things fractured, as long as he wore the crown. If Alexander's empire had been a single enormous banquet table, the wars of the successors turned it into a food fight that lasted decades. The generals, now self-styled kings, couldn't stop throwing spears the way children fling bread rolls. Antigonus wanted it all, his ambition stretching wider than his missing eye could see, while Cassander, Seleucus, Ptolemy, and Lysimachus each guarded their slices of territory like jealous siblings hoarding cake. Alliances formed faster than tavern gossip and collapsed just as quickly. One day, two rulers toasted friendship. The next day, they were marching armies at each other's walls. Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, and Mesopotamia became arenas for endless showdowns, each battle more theatrical than the last. Elephants thundered in, phalanxes clashed like giant accordions of steel, and siege engines smashed cities that had already been smashed twice before. For the common people, it was like living in a historical soap opera. The cast never changed, only the alliances and betrayals. What Alexander had united in a dazzling sprint, his successors unraveled in a drawn-out marathon of stubbornness, egos, and endless war drums. While Alexander's generals bickered endlessly over land and crowns, Greek culture decided to go on a world tour. Suddenly, gymnasiums popped up in Bactria, statues of Zeus found themselves lounging in Persian courtyards, and philosophers who once argued in Athens were now debating in marketplaces from Mesopotamia to the Indus. Local rulers mixed Greek fashion with their own. Think Persian nobles strutting around in togas, or Indian kings adding laurel wreaths to their already elaborate crowns. The fusion wasn't just about looks. Theater, philosophy, and even Greek language spread like wildfire, making the phrase opa a little more international. Of course, this wasn't a one-way street. Greek soldiers developed a taste for Eastern spices, exotic fabrics, and elephants, though the elephants weren't quite as enthusiastic about joining the phalanx. What Alexander started with his conquests, his successors continued in cultural mashups that would put any modern fusion restaurant to shame. In short, while the empire splintered into feuding kingdoms, Greek ideas refused to stay home, hitching rides across Asia and planting seeds that would blossom into the vast Hellenistic world. If Alexander had left behind a single monument to rival his conquests, it was the city of Alexandria in Egypt. Under Ptolemy's rule, this bustling metropolis quickly became less of a city and more of an ancient Google search engine. The famed Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building, it was an information hoarder's dream, crammed with scrolls on everything from astronomy to how to pickle olives. Scholars from Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and India gathered there, arguing over math equations and trying to one-up each other with exotic knowledge. Outside, the lighthouse of Pharos gleamed like an ancient skyscraper, guiding ships and making every sailor say, "Now that's what I call GPS." Merchants brought spices, papyrus, and ideas, turning the city into a cultural stew. Philosophers, poets, and scientists rubbed elbows in cafes, or whatever the ancient version of cafes was, making Alexandria the ultimate think tank. While Alexander's empire was busy falling apart, his city thrived as the beating brain of the Mediterranean world, where knowledge was the new weapon and books were sharper than swords. Even though Alexander's empire had splintered faster than a dropped amphora, his image lived on, larger than life. To some, he was the fearless conqueror who outpaced Hercules and rivaled Achilles. To others, he was the charismatic ruler who made philosophers roll their eyes while generals sharpened their swords. His face began to pop up everywhere, on coins, statues, mosaics, basically the ancient version of a celebrity endorsement deal. In Egypt, he was remembered as Pharaoh, in Persia as Shahanshah, and in Greece as the golden boy who made it all look too easy. Artists exaggerated his lion-like hair, giving him the eternal look of someone who had just stepped out of a salon with divine approval. Tales of his exploits grew taller than the Pharos lighthouse, how he tamed nations, befriended gods, and always struck a pose with his hand pointing toward the horizon. Even centuries later, emperors and kings invoked his name like a magical password, hoping some of that glory would rub off. Alexander might have been gone at 32, but his myth had signed a lifetime contract. From the dust of one mighty empire, a patchwork of kingdoms emerged like quarrelsome siblings squabbling over inheritance. This was the birth of the Hellenistic world. Not one crown, but many, each insisting they were the true heirs of Alexander's glory. In Egypt, Ptolemy polished his new pharaoh title. In Asia, Seleucus juggled satrapies like a circus act. In Macedonia, Antigonus and Cassander bickered over thrones as if it were a family sofa. Instead of unity, the empire split into colorful shards, each glowing with Greek influence but tinted by local flavor. Philosophers and traders crisscrossed these lands, carrying ideas faster than gossip at a symposium. Greek temples stood next to Persian palaces, while Egyptian gods found themselves rubbing elbows with Olympians in the same pantheon. What was once one man's dream of world domination turned into a cultural fusion buffet, with everyone invited. The irony? Alexander's empire may have collapsed, but the world he stitched together with his sword and charm lived on, transformed into a Hellenistic mosaic that would outlast even his most ambitious conquests. Generals across centuries treated Alexander's campaigns like the ultimate cheat sheet of warfare. His blend of lightning-speed cavalry strikes, phalanx discipline, and unpredictable tactics turned battlefields into his personal chessboard. Romans studied him like school kids cramming for exams. Napoleon openly admired him, and even modern officers peeked at his playbook. His strategy of striking fast, hitting hard, and keeping enemies guessing was like the military version of stand-up comedy, always catching opponents off guard. From siege engines that looked like rolling fortresses to his genius use of terrain, Alexander's methods became templates for generations. And let's not forget the psychological game. He could terrify foes just by marching straight at them with a glare that said, "Hope you packed your will." His campaigns weren't just about swords and spears. They were about momentum, morale, and timing, lessons that armies still repeat centuries later. Ironically, while his empire didn't survive intact, his military brainchildren outlived him by thousands of years, proving that sometimes the sharpest blade is not bronze or iron, but strategy itself. If Alexander's armies carried swords, his true weapon was culture. The wave of Hellenization he unleashed rolled across Asia faster than a rumor at a royal banquet. Greek theaters popped up in cities where people barely knew what a toga was. Markets suddenly sold olives and wine alongside local spices, and scholars debated Plato under palm trees. Persian nobles found themselves quoting Homer, while Greek sculptors started carving gods that suspiciously looked like local deities in disguise. This cultural blend wasn't a one-way street. It was more like a dance party where everyone brought their own instruments. From Afghanistan to Egypt, Greek ideas mingled with local traditions, giving birth to hybrid art, architecture, and philosophies. It was the ancient world's ultimate cultural mashup, part symposium, part Bollywood, part bazaar. Ironically, while Alexander's empire split faster than a wedding cake at a hungry feast, the cultural flavor he spread stuck around, seasoning entire civilizations for centuries. Long after his empire vanished, people still spoke Greek, built Greek-style cities, and sprinkled a little extra feta on history salad. That's the power of ideas. They don't just conquer, they linger, remix, and trend forever. If cities were trophies, Alexander's shiniest prize was Alexandria. Founded on the Egyptian coast, it wasn't just another port. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a flashy tech startup hub. Wide streets cut in neat grids, a massive lighthouse taller than any gossip tower, and of course, the library. The Library of Alexandria, where scrolls piled up like unreturned Netflix DVDs. Scholars flocked from everywhere, carrying their papyrus like students cramming before exams, eager to debate philosophy, medicine, and even questionable astrology. Imagine a place where you could bump into a mathematician, a poet, and a doctor all in the same hallway. And yes, they'd argue about everything. This was where the brain power of the known world converged, turning knowledge into a superpower. Ironically, while Alexander never lived to see the city thrive, it became the jewel of his legacy, a place where ideas were hoarded, traded, and occasionally set on fire. Oops. Alexandria stood as proof that empires crumble, but libraries, at least until someone burns them down, can outshine even the mightiest armies. When a man's life is this legendary, it's only natural that myth and literature can't resist turning him into a superstar. Alexander quickly became more than flesh and blood. He was upgraded into a larger-than-life character, fit for bedtime stories and epic poems. In Greek legends, he was compared to Achilles, except with fewer sulky tent withdrawals and more world domination. In Persian tales, he appeared as Iskandar, a heroic wanderer mixing philosophy with battlefield bravado. Even medieval romances painted him as the globe-trotting adventurer who somehow managed to reach the heavens, dive into the oceans, and chat with monsters. Basically, the original fantasy protagonist. Writers couldn't resist putting words into his mouth, making him a philosopher king who dropped wisdom between conquests. The irony? Alexander probably never read half the books that glorified him later. Yet, the pens of poets and scribes ensured his name marched even further than his armies ever did. The battlefield gave him fame, but literature gave him immortality, turning a conqueror into a character who could never retire from history's stage. If imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, then Rome practically wrote Alexander a love letter. Centuries later, Roman generals still fangirled over him like teenagers with posters on their walls. Julius Caesar, upon visiting a statue of Alexander, supposedly burst into tears, not because marble was moving, but because at Alexander's age, Caesar had only conquered political debates, not continents. Pompey styled himself as the new Alexander, and even Mark Antony liked to cosplay in Alexander-inspired armor, minus the global domination. Roman military handbooks quietly borrowed Alexander's tricks, from the phalanx formations to the art of psychological warfare. But it wasn't just about tactics. Roman leaders were captivated by the idea of blending charisma, vision, and a dash of audacity into empire building. They tried to walk in his sandals, though most tripped on the laces. Alexander set a bar so high that even Rome, the ultimate superpower, measured itself against a man who lived and died before their republic was fully grown. His influence didn't stop at borders. It became the blueprint for imperial ambition itself. From marble statues to glowing mosaics in churches, Alexander refused to stay in the history books. He strolled right into art galleries and temples. Painters couldn't resist giving him flowing locks and heroic poses, even when the real Alexander probably had battle sweat and messy hair. In medieval Christian art, he sometimes appeared as a quasi-saintly warrior, almost like the Marvel superhero of the ancient world. Islamic traditions also absorbed his image, identifying him with Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a mystical ruler traveling across the ends of the earth. Talk about cross-cultural casting. Meanwhile, Renaissance artists rebranded him as the embodiment of ambition, chiseling every muscle to perfection as if Michelangelo himself was his personal trainer. Sculptors loved showing him with lions, thunderbolts, or gazing majestically at horizons, as if he just spotted another continent to conquer. Even religious texts and legends couldn't resist. Alexander became a symbol of divine mission, or at least of a man too extraordinary to be ordinary. His image traveled farther than his armies ever did, conquering imagination across cultures. Alexander's death at only 32 sparked one of history's juiciest debates. Was it poison, served in a golden cup by a jealous rival? Or was it a tropical fever that decided the world's greatest conqueror should take a break? Some storytellers swore his generals, tired of endless marching, slipped something nasty into his wine. Others suggested the gods, annoyed at his audacity to call himself divine, pulled the plug. Modern historians argue about malaria, typhoid, or autoimmune disease. But let's be honest, none of those are as dramatic as the idea of a secret assassination at a royal banquet. Ancient gossip didn't help either. Rumors spread faster than cavalry charges, and each version got juicier with every retelling. Picture Babylon's corridors buzzing with conspiracies, each theory louder than the last, while Alexander lay silent, leaving everyone guessing. His death became less about medicine and more about myth, fueling endless speculation. In the end, the mystery only added to his legend, because what's an epic story without a cliffhanger? Centuries after his death, Alexander refuses to pack his bags and leave history's stage. His memory sneaks into classrooms, parliaments, and even bedtime stories, as if the man himself signed up for eternal guest appearances. In the East, he became Iskandar, a heroic figure in Persian and Islamic traditions, mixing more myth than fact. In the West, he was hailed as the prototype of the world conqueror, inspiring rulers from Rome to Napoleon. Ordinary people weren't left out either. Folk tales turned him into a monster slayer, a seeker of immortality, or a man who chatted with sea creatures while riding in a glass diving bell. Because why not? Monks scribbled about him, poets romanticized him, and generals studied him like a playbook. It's as if the collective memory of humanity said, "We're not done with you, Alex." His image became less about one man and more about the dream of going beyond limits. Every retelling, whether accurate or wildly imaginative, kept him alive, not in flesh, but in imagination. If Alexander's story teaches anything, it's that ambition can be both rocket fuel and quicksand. He reached farther than anyone dreamed, carving an empire from Greece to India, but his soldiers collapsed under exhaustion, his empire shattered after his death, and his dream of endless conquest turned into a cautionary tale. His life is the ultimate paradox, a man who seemed unstoppable, yet constantly running into the limits of human endurance, politics, and plain bad luck. Historians love to debate whether he was a visionary or just a guy who didn't know when to take a vacation. Philosophers treat him as the poster child for hubris, while military academies still admire his brilliance on the battlefield. The lesson is clear. You can stretch the boundaries of the possible, but eventually reality pushes back. Alexander shows us that greatness often walks hand in hand with fragility, and that even the boldest ambitions need humility to keep them grounded. And so, the tale of Alexander closes not with the clang of swords or the thunder of horses, but with a whisper that still echoes across centuries. Immortality through memory. His empire fractured, his ambitions cut short, yet his name refuses to fade. From dusty classrooms to military academies, from grand statues to pop culture references, Alexander keeps reappearing like history's most persistent cameo. Some call him a conqueror, others a dreamer who flew too close to the sun with no safety net. But in every retelling, one truth remains. He dared to go further than anyone thought possible. And while his body rests in mystery, his legacy struts confidently across the stage of human history, reminding us that greatness is not about how long one lives, but how deeply one imprints on the world. In the end, Alexander didn't just conquer lands, he conquered time itself, becoming less of a man and more of a legend that history refuses to let retire.